The story I have for you today truly earns its title. It is a classic locked-in-a-room mystery that points in two different directions, leaving authorities and the victim's loved ones divided. This is the story of Hugues de la Plaza. It's a little after 8 on Saturday morning, June 2nd, 2007, in San Francisco, California. That's when a guy named Carl steps outside onto the front porch of his apartment building. This apartment building is a standalone triplex-style deal, with 3 units all in a row on the ground floor, their doors side by side. Carl steps out to grab his morning paper, but when he bends over to pick it up, something stops him cold, something he can't quite compute. It's blood. A pool of blood at the base of a small set of steps leading to the sidewalk. And there's another at the top of the landing. There's even blood streaks across the handrail and, more alarmingly, dripping from his neighbor Hugues de la Plaza's door handle. Carl runs inside and calls 911, insisting they need to come right away. The police arrive within minutes, rushing to Hugues' front door where they knock several times, but there's nothing. It is silent. They check the door to see if they can get in, but it's locked, same with the door at the back of his unit. However, they are able to look through a window, and inside they see even more blood, which gives the officers all the probable because they need to break down that back door. What they find inside is far worse than what they saw outside on the front steps. According to an SF Weekly article from 2007, blood is everywhere, on various surfaces, tracked all over the floor in shoe prints, even dripping down the walls. There's a trail of blood on the floor leading to the living room, and it's there that they find the body of 36-year-old Hugues. He's lying on the floor face up, and when paramedics arrive, they realize there is nothing they can do. He has lost too much blood by this point. He is already deceased. At first, the paramedics think he's been shot, purely based on all the blood they were seeing. But when the medical examiner arrives, she realizes that's not correct. He's actually been stabbed multiple times, once each in the neck, the chest, and the stomach. But what he was stabbed with is unclear. There's not a knife laying near him, though investigators on the scene do find a pair of knives in the kitchen that are the right size to cause those wounds. The problem is, there's no visible blood on those. They could have been washed. Actually, one of them was found in the sink. So it's plausible. Either way, they collect both of them for testing. They also take samples of all the blood and even some hairs that they find inside the apartment too. Right near Hugues' body, there are signs of some kind of struggle. There's a TV that's overturned and a broken wine glass. They also find a broken watch pinned underneath him that looks like it's been almost ripped off his wrist. So was he attacked outside his apartment or inside? They don't know quite yet. They were initially thinking that maybe it happened inside, and then the killer had tracked the blood out because of all those shoe prints everywhere. But what they end up finding out is that every single one of those shoe prints were made by the shoes Hugues was wearing. Then it had to have happened outside, and Hugues ran into his apartment to get away. Probably why and how the door was locked behind him. The more they look around, the more it seems like no one else came inside at any point other than Hugues, obviously. According to an SF Gate article by Katie Dowd, there's no indication that a window was forced open or anything like that. Plus, the doors were locked. Again, when they were trying to get in initially, if you remember. They also rule out robbery as a motive pretty quickly too, because Hugues' computer is there, his cell phone's there, wallet all still there. But if he was attacked outside and made it in, why didn't he call for help? It's odd. His cell phone is one of the few items in the house that actually isn't covered in blood. So he didn't make it to it or didn't even try. Something just isn't adding up here already. The investigators are thinking, okay, maybe talking to the neighbors will help us piece this together. Again, he's in this triplex-style thing with 3 units, all sharing walls. Hugues is on one of the end units, so he's sharing a wall with at least one person. But there's a problem. No one, when they go talk to them, seems to have heard anything. Not a struggle, or at least nothing alarming enough that would prompt them to have called police. which honestly kind of makes sense. His one neighbor didn't even realize anything was wrong until he went out for the paper that morning. That was Carl, and Carl didn't even have much more to add that would have helped police. But the other neighbor, not Carl, tells police that around 2:40 a.m. He did hear Hugh's door open and then close 3 times, he says, over the course of just a few minutes. He also says he heard footsteps running downstairs and at least 2 thuds, one loud enough to shake his wall. So again, he's hearing something, but it wasn't enough for him to think that something was even wrong in Hugh's apartment. From what I gather, it sounds like he just kind of chalked it up to apartment living in a big city kind of thing. And it's also happening over the weekend. Hugh's was known to be a partier. His neighbor might have known this, and that probably wasn't the first time he heard late-night noises coming from next door, just some coming and going. But this account, even though he didn't know it at the time, does help investigators put together a timeline of Hugh's final hours. When they look at a neighboring building's security camera footage, it actually captured Hugh's walking home alone on the sidewalk around 2 a.m. Just steps from his apartment. Now, because of where this camera is, it doesn't actually show him walking into his apartment or even the front steps leading up to where all that blood was found. And it also didn't capture any sort of attack or anyone else entering or leaving the area. But there also was that back door. Someone could have gone in or out that way. From what I gather, it doesn't seem like there are any cameras in the back of the building or any of the neighboring buildings in that direction, because nobody talks about any other kind of camera. And the footage that we do have, we're not talking top quality. According to Katie Dowd's reporting, that camera was motion activated and blurry. Remember, 2007 is like the days before doorbell cameras on every door years away. So what they have is sparse. It is not catching everything, and it's not even recording 24/7. But yes, they have something to work with. Now, even though they know Hugh's got home around 2, they need to backtrack and figure out where he was before then. They do that by talking to some of his friends. Those friends tell investigators that he worked until about 5 p.m. And then he went on a date, which was apparently a pretty regular thing for him. He was always on dating sites, always going out, kind of known to be a bit of a player in 2007 terms. After his date at around 10:30, he met up with some of his friends and coworkers at a club. Apparently, he'd recently gotten a promotion and wanted to celebrate. This group basically partied all night and closed the place down. They say that Hugh's left alone and headed home, which is where that neighbor's security camera caught him. It's like a 10-minute walk from the club back to his apartment. But when they're looking at the whole picture, he is walking home at 2 o'clock in the morning. He has been drinking, and as investigators are learning more about the area he lives in, they realize that he does live close to an area that's known to have a higher crime rate. So even that short 10-minute walk does leave a lot of possibilities on the table, including apparently suicide. Where did that come from? It came from police. But why? From where? What evidence? I don't know exactly when this idea formed, but it was clear that they already had a bit of a theory when they were talking to his friends and neighbors, asking questions about his personal life. Did he use drugs? Was he depressed? Was he suicidal? Now, from what I can tell, just about everyone they speak to says that he hadn't shown any signs of depression. But that answer didn't seem to hold much water with authorities, because within days, they were pretty sure that Hughes stabbed himself. The investigators' theory goes a little something like this. They think that Hughes might have taken some drugs at the club or bought some drugs on the walk home. And then he entered his apartment, high and drunk, and for some reason, that combination of alcohol and drugs caused him to take a knife from the kitchen and stab himself in the stomach, in the chest, and in the neck. How does blood get outside the apartment then? Well, investigators think that after he stabbed himself, he washed the knife off in the sink, and then he walked around his apartment as he bled out. Then, at some point, he went outside. They don't explain why he would have done that. Then he comes back inside, locks the front door before he collapses in the living room, and dies there. I'm sorry. I can't decide what part of the scenario is most outlandish. I know, when I was putting it together, I was like, I feel like I missed part of the story, but there is no part to miss. It feels like 0 to 60. And take your pick. Every part of this doesn't make sense. Not having a weapon at a suicide isn't just a small red flag to overlook. It's kind of a fundamental part of the case. Listen, I agree. And on top of that, there is one other thing that at least points to the potential of foul play. There are some wounds that the M.E. does say could be defensive wounds. A superficial injury on the left side of his forehead, and a small bruise on his right forearm. And that's it. Hence, there could be defensive wounds, not definitively are defensive wounds. But even those, it seems like investigators just brush them off, and they point to the fact that Hughes was a black belt in karate. So what they say is, if someone attacked this guy, he had the skills to fight back. And so in turn, they think that he would have suffered far more substantial and very obvious defensive wounds if that's what happened. Okay, so what about the main wounds? Are there any hesitation marks or anything like that? I just can't fathom. To be gruesome, stabbing yourself in the neck all the way to your lung on the first try. It's a good question. Honestly, I don't see anything in the research material or the medical examiner's report mentioning something that would have been like a hesitation mark. So either there were none or they weren't noted, or the wounds are so deep they couldn't tell or something like that. I don't know. Either way, when Hughes' family and friends learn about this suicide theory, not only do they flat out reject the idea that he was suicidal, but they think the whole theory is absurd. They point to their own evidence as to why. First off, there was no suicide note. And then remember, he was out celebrating a promotion on the last night of his life. He was also apparently considering buying property in Argentina and planning to move there. They say he wasn't in some sort of financial difficulties or anything like that. The dude had money in the bank. And I feel like we say this all the time, but I think it bears mentioning again. You never really know what someone's going through. He could have had all these things going for him and still not be in a good place. I totally agree. But there was something else that the family pointed to as well. And this one, I can't totally get past. Apparently, Hughes couldn't stand the sight of blood. The smallest amount made him queasy, according to what his ex-girlfriend Melissa said in a Yahoo News article by Jason Deeren. So even if he is, like you're saying, suffering in silence, he has all these great things going for him, but like something was going on, even if he was going to take his own life, no one who truly knows him thinks that's the way he would do it. Did his friends notice anything out of the ordinary that last night out that he was on a date earlier? Maybe that didn't go well. Well, one of his friends does mention that he told him the date didn't go well, but it didn't even seem like a big deal to that friend. Because remember, Hughes dated a lot. People say multiple dates a week. So it's not like one bad date would bother him so much that he wants to take his own life. And all his friends said the same thing about his demeanor that night, that he was happy and he was smiling, laughing, and enjoying himself. And sure, he was also a little drunk. They all were a little drunk that night, but he had even made plans with one friend to ride motorcycles the very next day. Then he made plans with another to see a movie. So, I mean, you can see why, from his family and friends' perspective, Hughes seemed to be living his best life. This was not on their radar, and they could not have been more surprised when this was the conclusion that investigators were coming to. So maybe it was drugs, or maybe something was laced. That's truly the only thing I can think of that would make you do something like that in this way. Maybe. I mean, everyone is still waiting on the tox results. And while they're waiting, actually his parents, who live in France, decide that they need to head over to the States. And this was the part that I actually found so gut-wrenching, as if they aren't already living a waking nightmare. When they come over, they actually have to stay in Hughes' apartment where this happened. So not only is that horrific, that means there's just zero crime scene preservation here. That's also correct. Yeah, I mean, But that's because SFPD doesn't think that there's a crime. So there's no crime scene, or at least not one that's being cordoned off for days or weeks to come back to, which, as I'm sure you can imagine, just kind of pushes Hughes' parents to lose complete faith in the investigation. So that's why just 8 days after his body is found, his parents start looking into things themselves with the help of a private investigator that they hire named John Murphy. Now, John comes and visits the apartment. He starts interviewing Hughes' friends and neighbors, and it becomes clear to him that this was indeed a homicide. He's not just dealing with parents who can't accept the truth. He keeps pointing back to one simple fact. There was no weapon. There was no weapon. In an SF Gate article, he makes it super clear. If Hughes had died by suicide, investigators would have found the weapon he used at his feet or in his hand. Period. And he says since that didn't happen, there is only one logical reason for what did happen: murder. And this PI has his own theory. According to John, he believes Hughes was fatally stabbed outside his apartment, right on that first landing where the neighbor saw all that blood. Hughes' father actually demonstrated how this could have gone down in that 48 Hours episode. And it makes sense when you see it. I'll try to explain the best I can, but we're going to have a photo of the apartment, like I said, in our show notes so you can see. But essentially, the theory goes that Hughes had come out of his apartment onto this landing above a small set of steps that just go down to the sidewalk. Now they don't know why he was out there to begin with. Maybe he was meeting a friend. Maybe he was getting some fresh air. Who knows? But they don't think he was coming home from his night out there. He was already inside. Well, what they're thinking is, so they've got the security camera footage that catches him coming back at 2 a.m. And then I think that they're basing all of this off of what his neighbor heard. He heard those noises like 40 minutes later coming from inside Hughes' apartment. So if he was stabbed around 2 when he got home, he couldn't have been making noises in the apartment 40 minutes later. He would have been long dead at that point. So again, they don't know why, but they're thinking he got home at 2 a.m. And then at some point he comes outside for some reason. And then maybe someone walked past. Maybe they interacted. That interaction ended with the individual stabbing Hughes in the stomach, causing him to bend over, and then he was stabbed in the chest and then in the neck. Now their thinking is that Hughes would have retreated to his apartment trying to escape the attacker, and then closed and locked the door behind him. So that keeps the attacker out. Hence why there's only one set of bloody shoe prints, and they're Hughes, just his. Yes. And now he is bleeding profusely all over his apartment. So he's kind of stumbling all over his apartment. Maybe overturns the TV, breaks the wine glass. Yeah. So, I mean, that's totally possible. We don't know for sure. I don't think we can make a ton of assumptions because I don't have pictures of exactly what it looked like. I mean, again, you could also say that happened in some kind of struggle before there was blood. Yeah, I guess I'm hung up on the shoe prints. If he's bleeding that profusely, you said there was blood all over the apartment, right? There'd be more shoe prints. That's what I mean. A struggle only makes sense if it's before he's bleeding. So I mean, I think the theory that they came up with, and I think your assumption is correct, is that it was probably when he comes into the house and he's knocking some stuff over. But I guess if he's stumbling around the apartment like this, why not go for the phone? Where was the phone exactly? I know this doesn't make a whole lot of sense. The phone is on his coffee table, which from everything that I can gather was near where his body ended up finally resting. Or at least from what I understand, it's like Hughes would have had to walk by it. So why he didn't go for it, or again, why he's not calling out to people. He's got neighbors. I don't know. They don't offer an explanation for that piece. But one thing does become clearer to John the PI when the toxicology finally comes out in July. That toxicology shows that there were no drugs in Hughes' system the night of his death. Well, that puts a giant hole in the police's theory. Sure does. Also putting a hole in their theory. Tests on the knives from the kitchen that they thought Hughes could have used to stab himself and then again went and did some dishes. Those knives showed no traces of blood. So SFPD investigators cannot account for any weapon in the apartment that Hughes could have used to stab himself. Because this is a homicide. But the perp is like a ghost. This report also reveals that the testing done on the hair and the blood from the scene, all of it belongs to Hughes. I mean, if there is someone else, there is no trace of this other person anywhere. And not even in all the blood outside. I'm convinced that this person never made it inside the apartment. For sure. That makes sense to me. But if the stabbings took place outside, then I mean that's where you have to look for evidence. That's where any evidence is going to be. I agree. I would want that stuff tested. According to an SF Weekly article, the blood outside was never tested because SFPD investigators felt that much like the blood evidence inside. The blood pooled in a way that didn't show signs of a struggle. Okay, even if you think that, you still need to test it. I agree. And they were criticized not just by us, but they were criticized by others for not doing that. Maybe they didn't even collect it. I don't know. It makes no sense to me. All of this aside, based on the PI's theory, though, I'm still left with a huge question. Why? Was this some random attack? Was it wrong place, wrong time? Does someone mistake him for someone else? I don't get the motive. It's not clear. And it's something that Hughes' family and friends start to really think about. I mean, as far as they were concerned, he had no known enemies. But that didn't mean he might not have made one. In that 48 Hours mystery episode, one of Hughes' friends talks about how Hughes didn't care if someone had a boyfriend or a husband. So, I mean, he said basically, his friend was just looking for sex from anyone and everyone. And yeah, maybe if they were attached, had a significant other, yeah, he might not even know that someone was after him or jealous or whatever. Exactly. It's like maybe he had an enemy that he didn't even know was an enemy, I think kind of thing. And John actually looks into this idea. I'm not sure if he's going back and interviewing old dates or what, but in doing this, he doesn't find anything to prove that someone Hughes went on a date with had a grudge or any potential disgruntled partners. There's nothing pointing to anyone, but doesn't mean it didn't happen. Yeah, but you can't prove that. You know what I mean? You can't do much with the things it doesn't prove. Right? We can't prove that it does, can't prove that it doesn't. It still needs to be investigated. Yeah. But that doesn't mean that they just give up. In fact, by October, John's not even the only one looking into Hughes' death anymore. You see, because Hughes is a dual citizen in the U.S. and France, once the French government gets word of his death, they actually send an investigator of their own who's based in Los Angeles to take a look at things. And to the family's surprise, this French investigator gets a hold of Hughes' computer, which up to this point, no one had been able to examine. I'm sorry. What computer? Yeah, they didn't really talk about it before this, which is why I didn't bring it up. I guess they had taken one from his apartment after he died. But apparently they couldn't actually get into it. They didn't know the password or whatever. So the French investigator, he actually brings in 2 computer experts and somehow they're able to get in. And what this new investigator finds is that on the night Hughes got home from the club, and not long before whatever happened, he was doing the typical things most people do on their computers, like surfing the internet. He's on dating sites. He's looking at real estate in Argentina. Like we've been talking about, not that most people are looking at real estate in Argentina, but again, that was a thing for him. But you get the point. This dude is just scrolling. Essentially, right? No searches related to suicide, no concerning sites, just really your average internet browse. Nothing is out of the ordinary, which they take to SFPD, and they're like, hey, look, this should show you where his head was right before he died. But even with this, the SFPD still refuses to list his death as a possible homicide. And the situation is just becoming so frustrating to Hughes' friends that in February of 2008, a group of them led by his ex-girlfriend, Melissa, actually file a complaint with the San Francisco Police Commission. But even more infuriating, they don't even get a response in return. So a month later, they file a complaint with the Office of Citizen Complaints, arguing that investigators were deliberately overlooking proof of a murder and their investigation was insufficient. And when this is happening, this is about the same time that journalists back in France have learned about what's going on in the U.S. with this investigation, or maybe lack thereof, and they start picking up the story there, adding even more pressure for answers. And this seems to work in Hughes' family's favor, because in June of 2008, 2 more detectives and a magistrate judge arrive from Paris to investigate his death. In that 48 Hours mystery episode, it says that they were allowed to do this under some, quote, rarely used treaty between the U.S. and France. And so this gives the family hope that they haven't had in almost a whole year. The French investigators don't mess around either. They start at the beginning, Hughes' apartment. They review all the material, retest all the evidence, and interview over 50 people. This includes all the witnesses and all of Hughes' friends. In that same 48 Hours episode, one of Hughes' friends says, quote, I was interrogated by the French police. I was a suspect. I loved it because I was really certain that those people were doing real police work. End quote. My little eyes perk up. Yours perk up. Oh my goodness. What friend is a suspect? And why did they love being one? Add that to a list of firsts. It's not something I've ever heard ever. But I don't think this friend was like a real suspect. As far as I know, he didn't have a motive or a reason to kill Hughes. From the bigger context of when this quote was made, I think it more reflects just the fact that they're just happy that the police were really working this case or some investigators were really giving it the due diligence it needed. Right? If he's been named a suspect or whatever, it means that someone is doing some work. Yes. Police from an entirely different country finally doing the things that SFPD should have been doing this whole time. Exactly. That was it. Now, by January of 2009, the family gets word that French investigators have completed their work. They put together a 2,000-page report of their findings. And in it, they declared that Hughes was in fact the victim of a homicide. But that's not all. They also announced that they've discovered new evidence that could lead them to his killer. In retesting all of the evidence, French investigators discovered unknown DNA on Hughes' watch band. And remember, that watch was found broken under Hughes' body. Now, frustratingly, I have zero info on how good this profile is, what was done with it, who they compared it against. I have all the questions. But all we know from our research is that the DNA was not Hughes. But as you can imagine, when his loved ones hear this, they're floored. Even though they don't have a match necessarily to the sample, and even though it actually might turn out to be from something totally innocuous, it might not be from the time he was killed. It is more than they had before. Exactly. And at the very least, this means that Hughes had contact with someone they can find and talk to and ask to explain why their DNA got on this watch. Agreed. But to be clear, Hughes' father's theory is that it's not innocuous. He says his son always wore his watch on his right wrist. So the thought is maybe he could have raised that arm to protect himself. And then the watch gets somehow broken in the process, and the attacker's DNA, maybe it's blood, for example, maybe it's rubbed off, or maybe the attacker grabs his arm, whatever it is, but the attacker's DNA gets left behind on the watch. And then again, Hughes runs to his house to retreat, goes in by himself, and then the watch falls off and lands underneath him. So to find the who of it all, the East Bay Times reports that the family offered a $100,000 reward for information leading to an arrest and conviction. They also asked the SFPD to open a murder investigation. And while that doesn't exactly happen, something does happen to move the needle. In August of 2009, a new chief of police comes into power at the SFPD, and he does recognize the need for a third party in Hughes' case. So he asks his former department, the LAPD, to look into it. That's almost unheard of. For sure. I mean, no police department wants another police department in their backyard checking their work, so to speak. But it needed to be checked here. And I don't think any department should be afraid of a second set of eyes or more resources, because honestly, SFPD just weren't getting it done. And I'm not saying it was the investigators' fault. It sounds like they didn't even have the resources they might have needed. But there was a lot of talk at the time of reforming the SFPD because of how low homicide closure rates were. So in my mind, I'm like, welcome the help, you know? Yeah, seriously, because in 2007, the same year that Hughes died, there were 98 murders in San Francisco and the SFPD only solved about a third of them, which was lower than the national clearance rate of 50%, which is still low. Well, right. And you have to wonder, is 98 really all the homicides? Or do you have a bunch that are being listed as something else, whether it's because it's like undetermined, you're trying to pad the stats, or, you're just not getting it done, like you said? Yeah. And when we talk about resources, I mean, here's the ugly truth. The lead investigator on Hughes' case was assigned 2 other homicide cases that week alone. So this guy is working 3 new homicides in 1 week. Plus, I mean, that's just that week. Most cases aren't getting solved in a week. He probably already has other cases. So you got 3 this week. How many the week before? How many the week after? And you begin to wonder how much time could he even really be able to give this case? A case that I think needed extra attention considering the circumstances. Yeah. And then it goes back to why were they pushing the suicide theory so hard? Was it because it was just the easier path that closes a case faster? That's basically the conclusion that Hughes' ex Melissa comes to, that they just didn't want to investigate this as a murder at all. But there were other families of other victims that felt some of the delays and incompetence happening with other cases around this time actually had more to do with them trying to keep those homicide numbers down, even if they're not great. Like, was the reality even worse? But however we got here, the LAPD are at least here now. And not long after the LAPD is given the case to review, Hughes' parents and Melissa meet with the new chief, and he surprises them with something that they didn't expect. Apparently, way back in February, the SFPD received a report from an independent medical examiner out of Marin County, which is about an hour north of San Francisco, who had reviewed this case. Oh wait, February? That's like 7 months ago. Yeah. 7 months ago. And there may be a reason that it had been kept under wraps till now, a reason that maybe they were hesitant to share it, because the Marin County medical examiner concluded that Hughes was the victim of homicide, which would be the last thing the SFPD would want to hear. I mean, it doesn't look good primarily because this guy who's now doing this other review had previously worked with the SF medical examiner's office. So the Marin County medical examiner determined that Hughes most likely died within 1 to 2 minutes, which they say is why he probably never even had time to call 911. And this medical examiner also found evidence of blood splatter along the outside step wall that would be consistent with a knife going into someone and then being pulled out, which is kind of what his father's theory was. I don't know what is causing confusion for these people. I don't understand what I'm missing here. Well, based on an episode of 48 Hours Mystery that aired on this case, it sounds like a lot of this theory stemmed from Hughes' ex-girlfriend Melissa. She ends up saying that she had mentioned the idea of suicide to investigators when they interviewed her. She said that she told them that Hughes was into Japanese culture, specifically samurai movies. And in samurai culture, if someone dishonors themselves, one of the ways that they could atone is to take a knife or a sword and stab themselves in the stomach. And since one of Hughes' wounds was to his stomach, they're thinking that he was trying to maybe imitate that, but with a knife and also stabbing himself 2 more times. It doesn't 100% line up. And on top of that, Melissa would later claim that she was merely speculating about that after she heard that investigators were calling it a suicide at the crime scene. So almost more of her making things make sense to a certain extent. not necessarily saying that this would be evidence, but saying, oh, like, if you're thinking this way, this could have explained this injury. Dot. Yeah, whereas other people position it like, well, we're thinking this because Melissa said this. Dot. And Melissa's like, I only said that because you said you were thinking this. Dot. It's like this weird round and round. Now, investigators say there is other stuff, not just Melissa's statement, that also points to suicide. And some of that we already know, like the 2 locked doors and the single set of bloody footprints, and the fact that Hughes didn't call 911 or call out for help at all. But there's also some of the blood evidence in the medical examiner's opinion that was not consistent with someone who was attacked and would be in a state of panic rushing around. If Hughes was on the move, the blood drops on the floor would have had this tail aspect to them, like the momentum of his movement would have caused the blood to hit the floor with momentum, making them not perfectly round or in oval shapes, like if a person was just standing there or moving really slowly. And in her opinion, these were just kind of pooling on the floor in sort of a circular shape. So basically what she's saying is that he couldn't have been moving around frantically. I guess that stuff kind of makes sense. It doesn't explain the washing or burying the knife thing. I don't know. Not having a weapon at a suicide isn't just like a small red flag to overlook. It's kind of a fundamental part of the case. Listen, I agree. But maybe it was put in and there's no match. Or maybe it was put in and they found something but it was explained. Like there's all these details we just don't have and so we just don't know. I do know that Hughes' family and friends still feel that his death could be and should be solved. And if they're right about what they think happened to their son, that means that somewhere out there may still be prowling the streets of San Francisco, a killer who could remain free.